Border adjustment tax is being scrapped from this reform consensus on taxes. So says Speaker Paul Ryan to Maria Bartiromo. Take a look.
Well, what we're trying to communicate is that we think most of all that is important is that we come to common ground on how to do tax reform so that we can get tax reform done in 2017. What I and other House leaders who have been pushing the border adjustment, I still think it's the way to go. I think that's the right kind of tax reform plan. But if it's going to stop us getting to consensus to get tax reform done, then we don't want that to happen, meaning the border adjustment. We want consensus to get tax reform done.
All right, so that goes. What else could go, or what could be added in, maybe to pay for all of this? Do you have to pay for all of this? The National Taxpayer Union's Mattie Duppler joining us, Forbes publisher, Rich Karlgaard, on what's ahead. Rich, what do you think is ahead? If he has scrapped that, he already told me he scrapped the idea of a surtax on the very wealthy guys like you. So what happens here?
I'm really encouraged by his flexibility because Paul Ryan, for all his virtues, is a bit of a tax wonk who sometimes ties himself up in knots and doesn't see the big picture. And one of the ways you tie yourself up in the knots is to be overly influenced by the Congressional Budget Office's estimates of what this will do. And the CBO really does not take into account the dynamic effects and consumer and investor behavior changes that result from tax changes.
Now the question, I guess, Mattie, is what happens here? I mean, if they are they going to go big or just go tentative? Are they going to go something that just will amount to a tax cut, maybe not even a big one, but not tax reform? What are you hearing? What do you want to see?
Well, I think that you see from the announcement yesterday by the Big Six, the administration, the Senate, the House leaders who were all in charge of this process, that they still want to go big. We're looking at tax reform and not just tax cuts or not just nibbling around the edges. And there's a couple of reasons to think that that could happen. One is that, and I think the biggest one, is that the voters who elected President Trump felt that they were left behind by the Obama economy. And so these are people who are looking for economic growth and economic opportunity. And I think what we have seen in the past is that the single biggest way to motivate the economy to start churning again is through comprehensive tax reform. So even though we haven't seen this at the federal level for several decades now, I think there's a real appetite and a real opportunity to get something done.
I'm just wondering, Rich, after the battle over health care and even over a relatively innocuous skinny repeal measure, and they couldn't all get together on that, who's to say that they can get together on anything approaching, anything of substance on tax cuts?
Well, nothing concentrates the mind like a hanging, and I think that the Republicans are now on the verge of hanging themselves in the 2018 election. So in a funny way, I think the failure of the health care repeal will work to their advantage on tax reform. They'll be that much more focused and eager to get it done.
I hope you're right, but Mattie, I'm already reminded after talking to so many of the moderates, members of the Tuesday group, and the conservatives like the House Freedom Caucus. They have very different ideas on taxes, particularly the conservatives. They don't care if they're paid for. They just think you got a considerable bang for the buck, and eventually the economy will benefit. Deficits will go down, even if they don't in the near term. And the moderates who say, well, don't count on that. Keep them neutral, revenue neutral, whatever the term is that's popular now, which would limit the size and scope of those cuts. So where do you see this going?
Well, I would argue that there's a lot more consensus on tax reform than there is on something as complex as health care. There's been a narrative that Republicans have campaigned for the last 7 years to repeal Obamacare and to get this right. But in reality, Republicans and conservatives have been working for several decades to try and find consensus on health care. So it's not too much of a question mark as to why 7 years maybe didn't yield the results that we wanted, culminating in the vote last night. But with tax reform, there is consensus. And I think it starts with the implementation behind it and why we are motivated to get tax reform done to begin with. Looking at what has happened over the economy for the last couple of years and having the evidence of big government spending, stimulus spending as the attempted motivators for the economy and noticing how it doesn't work, we now have a template for why tax reform is an important component of an agenda moving forward.
By the end of this year?
I think it could be done by the end of this year. I remain optimism about tax reform until proven otherwise.
Rich, what about you? By the end of the year?
I think their reputations, their lives are on the line.
Well, they were on the line with the health care thing,
and they will get it done.
They didn't seem to be able to get their act together.
I think this one's different. I think they'll get it done.
All right. We'll see what happens. Guys, thank you both very, very much.